Okay, today's going to be what we call multiple deposit expansion, fractional reserve banking, and this is how our Federal Reserve Bank is going to create money out of money. So I know that sounds silly, but we're going to take our first example. So say you got 10 bucks and you go put it in the bank. When you go put that money in the bank, that is going to be what we call a demand deposit. So a demand deposit is a deposit you put in the bank that you can demand at any time you want. And you actually own that money. So the bank owes that to you. So if we had a T-chart, like from accounting, we would have assets and liabilities. So a liability is what the bank owes you, and an asset is what the bank owns. So they either owe it or they own it. So when they owe it, say you put your $10 in the bank. Now, of your demand deposit, by law, there's what we call the reserve ratio. And the reserve ratio is a percent of your demand deposit that the bank must keep. They have to keep this in the bank. Okay? Remember the Great Depression when we had the run on banks and people ran to the bank and took all their money out? Well, we needed laws set up to prevent that. So the Federal Reserve Bank would set forth the reserve ratio, and that's going to make them have the required reserves, or reserve requirement. So if they are required to keep money in the bank, this ratio is set at a certain percentage, and it's usually 10%. Hey, that's pretty standard. It's been that way for a really long time. So if I got my $10 deposit, now all of a sudden, if there's a reserve ratio of 10%, that bank has to keep 10% of my 10 bucks. So my 10 bucks is deposited, the bank has to keep $1, right? So they have their required reserves of my dollar. Okay? Now, banks are in business to make loans. That's how they make money. Okay? They want your deposits. That's why they offer you free checking, student checking, all these different things. They need your money so they can loan it out and charge interest rates on it. Okay? So they got to keep some cash in the vault by law. So everyone can't run to the bank and pull it all out and the bank collapses and dies. Okay? So these are called excess reserves. Okay? So this, they can't loan. They cannot loan this money out. So they cannot loan that money out. Excess reserves, they can loan that out. Okay? So if there's $10 of a demand deposit and required reserves is $1 because the reserve ratio is 10%, now the excess reserves can be how much? $9. So now this bank has required reserves of $1 that they got to keep in there. Then they have excess reserves of $90. And they can loan that out. So when they loan that out and someone borrows it, then they go deposit in their bank, and then their bank has to keep 10%. Then they loan out that, then they loan out, loan out, all the way until nothing's left. So what we get is what we call fractional reserve banking, because this $10 now, a fraction of it must be kept in reserves. So then the rest is loan out, so fractional reserve banking. So this $10 right here is going to become $100. Now, if I had a $100 bill, you can hear me digging in my desk, to show you, I would, but I'm a teacher and I don't have any money. So, all right. Yeah, I thought I did. Anyways, so this $10 will become $100 in the economy. They'll create 90 more bucks out of that. Pretty amazing concept, right? All right. So if we take our required reserves and excess reserves, we add those together, that's going to give you total reserves or bank reserves. So on an FRQ, which you love, a lot of times they'll give you what the total reserves are, how much has been loaned out, how many demand deposits there are all. They'll give you all these variables, and you'll have to solve for one of them, okay? And one of the ways you're going to solve for those is with what we call the money multiplier. So the money multiplier. We had multipliers for government spending. Remember, that's 1 over MPS, or 1 over MPC minus MPS, or minus MPC over minus EPS, the tax multiplier, all those. But this is another version of it. So this money multiplier, instead of making all these T-charts and deposit and keep, deposit, keep, loan, all that stuff, we're not going to do all that. We have a formula to do that for us. Okay, so the money multiplier, we're going to solve this by taking 1 divided by the reserve ratio. Okay, and our reserve ratio is this up here, right? And they might call it reserve ratio, required reserves, percentage, whatever. So that's the percent they must keep, so that 10%. So the reserve ratio is going to be how we solve our money multiplier. So if we have our 10%, that's going to equal to 1 over 10%, which is equal to 1 divided by 0.10, which is equal to 10. So that's our money multiplier of 10. So now, if we want to find out how much money can be created without doing all of these T-charts all the way out to 0, we take our change. If we want to see a change in the money supply, remember the money supply is M1, M2, and all that. So M1, what we learned that was made of last time, demand deposits, cash, coins. And these demand deposits, they also call them checkable deposits. So those checks, checkable deposits, mean you can write a check, which in reality we don't do. We use our debit cards, right? So demand deposits, cash, anything liquid. Remember, liquid can be cash. So demand deposits and checks or checkable deposits. That makes up M1. This M2 is like time deposits, savings accounts, stuff like that. But what we'll be dealing with mostly is deposits and bond purchases by the Fed, and I'll get to those in a second. So now what we're looking at, change in money supply is going to be equal to our excess reserves times the money multiplier. So we're going to see when this bank can loan out its excess reserves by how much of a fraction is kept in each bank and make that into a formula. So this is going to be equal to our $9. Remember, that's what they can loan out, right? I'm sorry, they're $90 because I imagine it was a deposit of 100 instead of my 10. But let's just keep it at 9, sorry. All right, so it's equal to 9 times what? Our money multiplier of 10. So that's going to be $90. So our change in the money supply is going to be $90. Our bank created that. They made it out of nothing. Where's my green? I like green, okay? So, look at that. We created $90 from this 10. And can everyone go take their money out of the bank at the same time? Yes, because the Federal Reserve has ways to do that. They can do overnight loans, things like that. If everyone showed up and said, we want our cash, that bank can order more cash from the Federal Reserve. Or when we get to monetary policy, we'll do some Fed funds rate, discount rate, in ways they do that. Okay, so now, examples. I know you wanted some examples. So what we have here is you're going to have some questions that you might have to answer on FRQs. So the first thing you might ask is, how are we going to calculate a change in excess reserves? And you'll see that when in the questions. So let's imagine we have a reserve ratio now of 20% and a deposit of $100 million. Okay, so if I want to find a change, and I use delta, this triangle, a change in excess reserves. Let me zoom in a little bit, or I can just keep using the marker, maybe that helps. Okay, so we've got our 20% reserve ratio and $100 million in demand deposits. Okay, if you want to do a T-chart, you could do your 100 million. Now at 20% reserve ratio, how much do they have to keep? Well, 20 million. How much can they loan out? 80 million. So what do we have now? How much can this single bank loan out? So a change in excess reserves is equal to 80 million. Okay, that's a simple question, but that's one step in solving all these things. Okay, now say they want you to calculate the change in loans. So banks can also do something, and let's do this with a bond purchase. Okay, so banks are going to do something with the Federal Reserve, where the Federal Reserve Bank is going to make a bond purchase, or you'll see it as open market operation purchase. That means the bank is going to buy bonds, or the Federal Reserve Bank is going to go to a bank and buy their bonds from them. So when they go to buy bonds from a bank has, something in their system called a bond. Say they have a $100 million bond. So if they have a $100 million bond, the Federal Reserve Bank is going to give them money for this. This money is going to be injected into the system. So the Federal Reserve Bank is going to take this bond from the bank, and then they're going to put that money into the bank. So anytime the Federal Reserve buys bonds, it's going to equal big bucks. So that means the money supply is growing. So when they buy something from a bank, they put that money in the bank. So now all of a sudden we have, say, our 20% reserve ratio, and we have a bond purchase of $100 million. So banks don't that's not a deposit. So $100 million went into the bank, and it wasn't a deposit. It was a bond purchase. So banks can loan all that out. So imagine how much money the Federal Reserve can make or create by doing this. So now all of a sudden, I'm going to take my money multiplier, which can be 1 over 0.2, because remember I have a 20% reserve ratio, and that formula is 1 over the reserve ratio. So 1 divided by 0.2 is going to equal to 5. Now I take that 5 times my 100 million, that's going to equal $500 million is going to be a change in how much loans will be created from that. Okay. Now, say we want to see how much there is a change in the money supply. Okay. So the money supply is different than how many loans can be created. So our money supply, say we have the same thing, 20% reserve ratio, and we have a $100 million bond purchase. Okay. So now all of a sudden, how much did the money supply change from this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take our original amount, our excess reserves. So if we have this, what is our excess reserves? 20% of 100 million. I have excess reserves, 80 million, don't I? Okay. Now, what's my money multiplier? Same thing. 1 over reserve ratio is 5. So times my money multiplier of 5 is going to equal $400 million is how much got created, or how much the money supply increased. Now the total, anytime you see total, don't forget they added that 100 million. So if they ask you for the total money supply now, we're at 500 million. Okay? Pretty awesome, huh? Now, anytime stuff like that happens and we have to find out what the max and the money supply or the total is, just add that back. Now the change in demand deposits is everything that's going to be, we take our excess reserves times our money multiplier, and we can solve for those also. Okay, I hope that helps. That's one of my longer videos. I'm sorry, but that's just something we got to do. Now, practice those FRQs.